Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. Thank you for joining us today for the 1T.org US webinar on the growing impacts of wildfire. We appreciate you taking the time and appreciate our speakers joining us today. And we are going to give folks another 30 seconds or so to get rolling. And then we will get things started. So thank you all for being with us today and appreciate it. We'll start in about 1 minute. Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, and welcome. My name is Kevin O'Farrell. I am the lead of 1T.org US, which is a partnership between the World Economic Forum and American Forests as part of the global effort to conserve, restore, and grow 1 trillion trees by 2030 as part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. 1T.org is a collection of public, private, and nonprofit entities who are united in their belief that trees and forests can play a critical role in addressing the twin climate and biodiversity crisis, while also adding value to human health and well-being across the US and around the world. Our community collaborative brings folks together on issues that are of timely cross-cutting importance and designed to sort of give some insights into some key critical issues affecting trees and forests around the United States and around the world. And we are hosting a series of these every month on different topics. So today we're really excited to dive in on and give a survey of what is all too often and all too prominent, if you're following the news, a growing issue around wildfire. Currently in California, the Park Fire is burning hundreds of thousands of acres. Is now the 5th largest fire in the state of California. In the state of Oregon, there's 29 active large fires that are happening throughout the state. So year after year, we're seeing more and more large, severe fires that are burning hotter, that are burning faster, and burning differently than the fires we've seen before. Just last year, Canadian wildfires emitted over 3 billion tons of CO2, which is 4 times the amount of CO2 emitted by the aviation industry. So if I can give you a sense of the scale of the issue that we're talking about, it is pretty stunning. Today, we've got a great couple sessions to talk through some of these issues. And before we do that, we wanted to bring in one of our colleagues from the American Forest side, Patrick Holmes, to help do some additional framing on the scale, the scope of the wildfire issue, and some of the things that are being done at the federal level and coalition level to address that. So Patrick, thanks for being with us. I'll turn it over to you to kind of help frame this for us. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I'm just going to offer just a little bit of context on the problem that we're dealing with, which I know will not be new for many of you on the call. As you know, wildfire is a natural phenomenon. It co-evolved with the species and peoples of the American West and our ecosystems over millennia. But today we're facing a historic rise in the frequency, severity, and extent of wildfires that really marks a severe departure from that historic norm. Since 1963, the top 5 years for burned acreage in the United States have occurred in just the last decade. And perhaps the most jarring finding that's out there is that from 1985 to 2017, researchers observed an overall 8-fold increase in the annual area burned at high severity across all Western US forests. Recent conditions have proved especially baffling for our wildfire managers, and that they're beginning to offer a glimpse of what we may be confronting in the future. A combination of really large-scale, long-duration fires, conflagrations that incinerate entire communities, extreme fire behavior that transfers embers across the crests of mountain divides, smoke reaching vulnerable populations in populated areas of the East Coast and around the globe, and rapid wildfire growth during nighttime events when firefighters could normally count on reprieve to work the fire line. In recent years, drought, persistent heat, and high wind events have contributed to really extraordinary conditions in North America, and the superlatives are punctuated by the list of the events. 2023's Lahaina fire on the island of Maui, the nation's deadliest on record. Kevin just mentioned the 2023 fires, 3 billion metric tons of CO2, contributing to about a quarter of global forest loss that year. The Marshall Fire near Boulder, Colorado in 2021, most destructive in that state's history, happening not in the summer, but on the day before New Year's Eve when snow cover normally blunts fire risk. Oregon's 2020 fires over Labor Day weekend, which we'll hear more about shortly, that state's most destructive. And those are all just a few of the events that have transpired since really 2018's Camp Fire changed our perception on wildfire risk nationwide. The causes of these conditions are many. They include a history of fire suppression, an accumulation of fuels due to changing management, and the curtailment of indigenous cultural burning practices. But they're all exacerbated by climate change-driven drought, extreme weather, and insect and disease infestation, as well as the complicating impacts on our management and wildfire suppression that more homes in the wildland-urban interface create. Anthropogenic climate change has made forest fuels about twice as dry as they would have otherwise been, making forest vegetation, both alive and dead, more likely to ignite and burn more completely with greater energy release. As writer Rebecca Solnit notes in her research on community responses to catastrophes, disasters shock us out of our slumber, but only skillful efforts keep us awake. Today, we see a lot of productive responses to our new wildfire reality, developing literal and proverbial anchor points and fire lines that can help us foster resilience in the face of these impacts. For the first time, by virtue of the Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we have investment in mitigation and recovery from wildfires approximating the scope of the scale of the challenge, creating some new enabling capacity to demonstrate results. And increasingly, a lot of new approaches to respond to the crisis have a few common characteristics. They're multi-jurisdictional in nature, reflecting the fact that fires know no boundaries and require a coordinated response at all levels of government among private landowners and tribal nations. So all hands, all land strategies. Secondly, they consider the need to adapt the entirety of the fire cycle through a holistic approach that includes prevention and mitigation, response and suppression, and recovery. And finally, they consider the needs of both the landscape and the built environment, reflecting the increasingly cross-sectoral impacts of wildfire events. As we transition to our other panelists here today, I think maybe that's the best place to leave things. With a quarter of Americans' exposure to harmful particulate matter now coming from wildfire smoke, fire is a public health crisis. With mounting liability operations and insurance costs and electric transmission systems, reduced solar energy capacity due to that same smoke, wildfire is an energy crisis. A contributing factor by way of lack of insurance, increasing costs in our affordable housing crisis, and so on. It's that increasingly cross-sectoral challenge that brings us all together, that recognizes that we need a diverse set of solutions and continued efforts to work collaboratively to achieve them. So I'll offer that I'm excited to be a part of the conversation today and add to that skillful awakening along with my colleagues, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate the contextualization around this and really setting in context that this is not really just a Western issue. This is through air quality and other things, an issue that's facing more and more Americans every day. So, and I also appreciate the nod to the cross-sectoral approach, and really excited to transition to our next panel and Our next speaker is Brian Kittler from American Forests and John Davis from Green Diamond Resource Company to talk a little bit about some of the impacts and strategies that NGOs are using in partnership with federal, state, local, and tribal governments, and how the private sector, from the land management perspective, is looking at the impacts of fire and the resulting investments that they're having to make and changes in management that they're endorsing. So I'm going to turn over to Brian Kittler to kick things off with a little extra contextualization, and we'll jump into a conversation with Brian and John. Brian, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. Let me just get my slides up here for folks. Are those coming through?
Yep. Loud and clear.
Excellent. So I have the joy and pleasure of leading American Forest Resilient Forest Program. It is our reforestation and forest landscape restoration program that we've operated since the early 90s. And I want to talk today about how that program and that work intersects with a lot of what Patrick was just talking about. And then also touch on American Forest policy work with regards to wildfire in that process. For those that are not familiar with American Forest as an organization, we are the country's longest running nonprofit organization that solely focuses on forest and conservation, dating back to 1875. And we were started by a group of citizens who were concerned about the loss of forests in the eastern United States, including from a series of destructive wildfires in the late 1800s. Over the course of the organization's lifespan, we were involved in establishing the forest reserves and the U.S. Forest Service in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and subsequently getting involved in things like the development of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put over 300,000 people to work all across the country and planted more than 3 billion trees. In the early 90s, as we were going through another iteration as an organization, we launched a reforestation program, which has since evolved to be our Resilient Forest Program. During that time period, we started doing on-the-ground post-fire partnerships with reforestation work, primarily initially with the U.S. Forest Service, and since then more broadly with other entities, public land management agencies, tribes, local communities. And since 2018, Patrick referenced the campfire of that year. We have seen escalating costs with wildfire response and suppression with our federal agencies. And in 2018, we helped address that issue with the U.S. Forest Service to help modernize their budget with the wildfire funding fix, which we advocated for alongside the Nature Conservancy and a number of other organizations and entities out there. And then Patrick referenced also the 2020 wildfire season in my home state of Oregon. That was the first of 2 subsequent years of really historic wildfire conditions all over the Western United States, where we saw large, high severity, fast moving wildfires consuming very large areas of forest land in a way that we really haven't seen the historical record at that scale. So American Forests dusted off our policy chops, and we developed a policy platform, which we carried into our advocacy work around the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law in 2021, and subsequently to introduce new funding and policies for fire. Likewise, I had the pleasure of serving on the Wildfire Commission, which was created by the Infrastructure Law to provide context for Congress around wildfire policy. So just a quick note on our Resilient Forest Program. Again, it's our reforestation program. It's place-based partnerships, it's boots on the ground, it's leveraging public and private funding, and applying climate-informed forestry and science to develop resilient landscapes for the future. We really take that climate lens seriously and are investing heavily in developing a climate-informed reforestation approach. And our goal as an organization and our Resilient Forest Program is focused largely on public lands and tribal and indigenous lands all across the United States, bringing about a movement to reforest those lands to the scale of the 17 million acres of potential reforestation opportunity that exists across public and tribal nation lands, and also proving out through the process of doing that a way to approach climate-informed reforestation, not just for American forests, but for the replication all across public, private, tribal lands in the US and beyond. And to get to that scale of activity, we really believe that the entire reforestation supply chain needs innovation, it needs partnerships, it needs coordinated and strategic investments. So we've organized our entire Resilient Forest program around a 9-stage supply chain framework, where we're working in partnership at each stage of these 9 steps to make critical investments to build out more capacity in the reforestation supply chain to get more work done on the ground. It all starts with partnerships with public land management agencies, with tribes, with private landowners. And we tend to start then in step 2 with climate-informed planning. So really thinking holistically at a landscape scale about what sort of treatments may be needed. Investing in other elements of the supply chain, from the seed collection and seedling production with nurseries to downscaling or climate planning work from the landscape to the scale of an individual reforestation unit in step 5. And then steps 6 through 8, really looking comprehensively at investments in site preparation, which is critical for reforestation, in particular in the post-fire context, addressing post-fire fuels issues, and then planting, natural regeneration treatments, and then maintenance and monitoring and adaptive management to kind of close it out. So really getting away from the notion that we just plant a tree and walk away, really investing holistically in the entire supply chain system. And since we've made that shift as an organization to investing in that entire supply chain, we've been having, I think, a greater impact. You can see the map on the left speaks to the projects across North America that we have invested in those green targets. Those are individual reforestation partnerships. You can see the close nexus there in the West Coast with a lot of work in the last 4 years after the series of wildfires that we've had. This year, we will have invested in reforestation projects and partnerships amounting to 21,000 acres, planting and regenerating 7 million trees. We're also working closely with private nurseries to grow seedlings for public lands reforestation in the Pacific Northwest. We have an active seed collection program in several states, applied research partnerships, nurseries and orchard management, where we're providing staffing to complement staffing at public nurseries and seed orchards. We're also pleased to be doing some innovative seed orchard management work, just getting going actually with Green Diamond and others in Oregon, and really investing in other areas of the problem. So when I talk about the problem, right, I think this image captures it for me. This is the campfire burning actively in 2018. Again, as Patrick noted, prior to Lahaina, this was the most destructive wildfire in US history in terms of loss of life and impacts to communities. The fire also was destructive from the perspective of forest loss and severity of impacts. Patrick alluded to that since the 1980s, really across my lifetime, we've seen an increase threefold in the amount of wildfire in the United States. And that in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. We've had a historic wildfire exclusion in a lot of our fire adaptive ecosystems. But what really is concerning is the increase in high severity fire. Patrick alluded to an 8-fold increase over that same time period. And that's fire that burns so hot that greater than 75% of the trees die in the fire. That impacts the ability to the forest to regenerate. It impacts the trajectory of the landscape in the future. So a lot of concerns are raised through that. If you never had the pleasure of standing in the middle of one of those high severity patches, here's a view from A peek in the bootleg fire. This is a fire that affected public lands, private lands. It is a fire that affected habitat, water quality, biodiversity, a lot of different concern. We lost a lot of old growth in this fire. Tribal and indigenous cultural sites were impacted. So just emblematic of the modern challenge that we're facing. Land managers are left wondering how to treat this landscape at a scale that we've really never had to think about. So transitioning to talk about policy for a minute. With those trends being in place, with more fire, with more high severity fire, the infrastructure law called for the Wildfire Commission. Wildfire Commission was impaneled. It was a 50-member commission that functioned over a year's time frame. It was this kind of pressurized environment that we had to operate within, essentially to develop recommendations for the US Congress to act on the wildfire crisis. We were charged with a number of activities, and we took a very holistic view of the problem. So we looked at wildfire across the entire cycle of pre-fire, response and suppression activities during fires, and then recovery and restoration following fires. And really, I think one of the greatest contributions of the commission was to reframe our collective thinking as a nation around the nature of the problem and realize that we have to invest in all phases of that, and that all phases are connected. The condition of forest landscapes before fire affects how those fires burn. How those fires burn affect how we restore forest landscapes after fire, and how we do that work after fire affects how they burn again in the future. So it's all connected. We operated on a consensus basis over a year's time frame. We came up with 148 recommendations, which was an amazing process to be a part of. Several of those recommendations are actively being moved forward now at this point through policy proposals in Congress. Chapter 4 of our report focuses on post-fire restoration. Patrick referenced a lot of need to think more in a cross-boundary or multi-jurisdictional framework. So I list 6 recommendations here that touch on climate adaptation, touch on investments in the reforestation supply chain, plus-ups to public programs, and really thinking in a cross-boundary approach to address the issue at scale. The issue at scale with regards to post-fire restoration and reforestation. Following the commission, American Forest recommitted ourselves to the policy advocacy work that we've successfully done to be thinking about how can we best advance the recommendations of the commission. So we have this nice report that we released in April. That's the cover on the left here. And really, it's organized into 4 sections, talking about the connections between post-fire recovery and reforestation and pre-fire work, growing the workforce, harnessing new technology to make better decisions across all phases of wildfire, and ensuring more transparency in our public and private investments. Lastly, I want to touch on the need for scaling partnerships to promote innovation and really focus on an example with American Forest. So we have entered into a $20 million partnership with the U.S. Forest Service that we are providing private match and funding to that public funding. And really, it's focused on providing thought leadership and prioritization for post-fire reforestation work across the national forest system. It's focused on implementation partnerships, so scaling the workforce and creating a more diverse body of entities that are engaged in national forest, post-fire, climate-informing forestation. Applying that science work that I talked about at greater scales to the problem, and then investing in the supply chain. There's a lot on the slide, but I want you to focus on the map and those bright orange spots. So that's the high severity of fire in the state of California and Southern Oregon that have burned since 2010, the majority of which burned since 2019. So Kevin referenced that there's active fires going on in Butte County, for instance, in California. You can see the Dixie Fire there, that huge blotch in the Sacramento River Basin. And you can also see to the north there, I mentioned the Bootleg Fire in Oregon. That landscape is one that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second. So with that landscape in particular, this is Klamath and Lake counties. We've seen multiple wildfires there in recent years. The conditions at which they burned, you can see here on this map. The dark area is areas of high severity. We've got a contiguous patch nearly the size of Washington, D.C., 10 times over. And what we set about to do as an organization is really apply that climate-informed planning approach collaboratively with private landowners, with the National Forest System, to start to think about how can we start tackling this issue and thinking about holistically both planting and reforestation treatments, fuel reduction treatments, making investments in areas that did not burn in high severity, so doing thinning treatments there, investing in prescribed fire, and really came up with a vision for how to bring that work to scale. And obviously it comes at a very high cost and a lot of coordination. So lastly, I just want to touch on how we can get to scale and what I believe this post-fire work needs to eventually grow into, talking about our replant initiative in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service. This year, we have a number of projects underway all over the Western U.S. in a post-fire context with the U.S. Forest Service. We'll be planting about 2 million trees with the Forest Service in California, Oregon, and Washington, and in some climate adaptation science projects up and down the West Coast as well. You name it. So really trying to bring that whole system to scale. All that's fueled by partnerships. I mentioned the U.S. Forest Service and their $20 million partnership with American Forests. We've got great partners in the Coca-Cola Foundation, Tepper Foundation, AES, Eddie Bauer, Cliff Bar, and others. And we know that this isn't just about American Forest in our partnership with the Forest Service. Other organizations out there, National Forest Foundation, Arbor Day Foundation, they are doing equally impactful, important work. And it's all about bringing this work to scale collaboratively across the entire system to address a massive and growing problem with post-fire work. Lastly, just want to touch again on the policy side of this. Patrick and I are participating in a new organization called the Alliance for Wildfire Resilience. That organization is continuing the work of the Wildfire Commission in more of an advocacy lens. So they have a policy discussion and a survey that you can scan the QR code here on the left to actually participate in. And you can track some of the bills that I referenced that have been introduced to carry forward the recommendations of the commission and other elements of wildfire policy with the QR code on the right. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Brian. Appreciate the additional context setting and want to bring in John Davis, the Vice President and General Manager for Green Diamond Resource Company in the Mountain West, into the conversation. And John, talk a little bit about Green Diamond and fire and sort of the before, during, and after framing that Brian laid out, and how you all as a private landowner are affected and how you're adapting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for setting the stage, Brian. So we're a privately owned, private family owned timber company. We were founded 133 years ago, or 134 years ago, 1890 in Olympic Peninsula in Washington, and most of our experience had been on the West Coast, on the far west of the Cascades, up till 2014, and so we're relatively new to this really fire-prone environment, and so we've got to learn along with the severity of these fires here, as folks have pointed out in the last 6 to 10 years, they've really the severity and the size and frequency have increased. So we're doing a number of things, not only proactively, but obviously reactively. So we partner with the local Forest Service, with ODF here in Oregon, in fire response, and then also in fuels projects. So we're in close communication with the Forest Service in regards to the types of projects they're doing and what we can do on our property to complement those, and which would eventually, hopefully, move into a space where we'll do some cross-boundary prescribed fire, which is a little bit unusual maybe for a large timberland owner to be interested in that. And then, as Brian mentioned, the bootleg fire, that was had a significant impact on us. We were impacted to the tune of about 110,000 acres during that fire. And something that we realized coming out of that fire was that restoration activities, they're expensive, and there's no insurance for a large private landowner that covers the losses associated with unsalvageable material or resources lost, or for the reforestation efforts that are needed after the fire. So Arbor Day Foundation stepped up and helped us the first couple of years with the cost of some seedlings. We greatly appreciated that. That first year, the first winter coming out of the fire, the winter of 21-22, we planted a million trees that year with no site prep activities. Those are expensive, and it's just another cost. And we found that if you react quickly and do that fast, that's an avoided cost, and we're seeing good survival in those plantations, over 80% survival. So we're really pleased with that. And then in addition, and as far as being proactive coming out of that, we've worked with the Forest Service in identifying pod boundaries, these potential operational delineations, and their key geographic features or roads where you might need to back up to stop a fire if you can't get an initial attack. And so within the fire footprint, we worked with the Forest Service to identify these boundaries, and we went and cleared hazard trees and cleared back 100 feet on either side of those boundaries post-fire, and essentially setting a fuel break scenario up from day one. So we're not going back and trying to fix something later. And we treated over 200 miles of road in that first year and a half after the fire to provide for that in the future, and also fire response and management access in the near future. So, again, cooperating with our partners has been really important. And the quick response, I think another important thing to note on that was during the fire that particular year, there was a good seed crop on both white fir and ponderosa pine that we noticed. And we actually, during the fire, while we were helping to fight the fire, we coordinated with cone collectors and got folks out on the ground on the perimeter of the fire and began a cone collection. We're able to collect a considerable amount of seed, and that ended up, it wasn't necessarily the nursery capacity that was the issue, it was the seed availability. And so that paid dividends for us in a quick action on that. So not looking, not sitting on your hands when there's an opportunity, and really keeping your eye out to be opportunistic in those instances.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Brian. And before we transition over to Kim and Kevin, I think I want to address the question in the chat, and it's addressed to Brian, but I think, John, I'd like both of you to answer it about how are we balancing fire smart tree species planting with high value timber species? And are you incorporating broadleaf species into the prescription? Any other changes to the species, seed stocking, supply, nurseries, etc.? So Brian, let you start, but then John, also you touched on the proactive versus reactive approach. So throughout the supply chain, yeah, I would love to hear from you both on this.
Yeah, it's a great question. We definitely plant species that are adapted to whatever site we're working in and whatever forest ecosystem that we're working in, and broadly representative of that ecosystem. Also have a strong focus on seed sourcing and ensuring that whatever we're planting will be adapted to the future climate that will be there. So we utilize the best available information from the U.S. Forest Service and others to do that. Just want to say too that John referenced a bumper cone crop the year after. We're looking at that same landscape this year to get out there and make a big collection push, because it's been a long time that some of those species have been producing seed, and we're seeing it this year. So it's kind of like you need to get out there when you can and move as quickly as you can and opportunistically as you can when you have the opportunities to do so. So just wanted to say that we're excited about this year. The fires were devastating, but nature has a way of bouncing back even in like the hardest of situations. And I think the cone crop that we're seeing is evidence of that this year.
All right, yeah, similar to what Brian mentioned, we looked at the fire adapted species. Fortunately, the three most fire adapted species are the ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and western larch. We have an abundance of ponderosa pine and a fair amount of Douglas fir in this area. We're right on the edge of the western larch, so we have some species to choose from there as far as conifer commercial type species. We similar to Brian, we used some climate models and looked at expected climate change in different scenarios to gauge the risk and seed source for these trees. So I think that's really important as you move into it. I mentioned that we had a bumper white fir crop. Just for a diversity perspective, we wanted to pepper white fir in with some of our reforestation, but it was a very small amount because it's not a fire resilient species. And the reality is these fires are not going to go away. They're here, and to pretend like there won't be another fire on this landscape for the next 70 years, I think would be naive. So I think one other thing to add, and it goes back to some the points Brian made in his initial comments. Are not necessarily related to this question, but a little bit is these fires, they're different. They aren't small fires affecting small portions of the forest. These are huge fires that are impacting communities and mills and jobs, and we can build houses back in a few months or a few years, but these forests, we're on the east side of the Cascades. We can't build a forest back in time to save those jobs, to save the communities, to save the businesses associated with those communities. It takes 70 years to grow a tree. The trees we're planting today will not be ready for a commercial harvest until my grandchildren are ready to retire. And my grandchildren aren't born yet. My children haven't reached a point where they're having kids yet. So we're talking about 2 generations and more than 2 careers before these forests even approach a space where I would consider them in a recovery or having recovered. So this is a really important issue, and really being forward thinking about the species selection and how you're setting this forest up for success in the face of future fires, because the fires are here to stay. So how are we going to be most successful with those on the landscape?
Brilliant. Thanks, John, and thanks, Brian. I appreciate you touching on the economic impacts to people in local communities too. And I think an excellent way to transition to our next speaker, Kim Davis, a research ecologist from the U.S. Forest Service, to talk a little bit about the proactive approach and some of her recent research that shows some really interesting things around thinning prescribed burns and fire severity. So Kim, turn it over to you to walk us through some of this really great work.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. I'm happy to be here, excited to be part of this conversation and share some of the recent research that I've been doing with collaborators from the Nature Conservancy as well as University of Montana to really focus on, do these fuel reduction treatments that we're have increased funding for that are being kind of widely implemented across the Western US. How well do they work for reducing fire severity? And so the focus is on fire severity, not area burn, because our forests are adapted to fire. We want fire in our landscapes, but we just have heard a lot about the impacts that high severity fire can have. And so we're focused specifically on how we can alter the way that wildfires are burning. And so in this talk, I'll really focus on kind of our drier forests, some of the forests that we are just hearing about with ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, these forests that historically burned at frequent intervals every 5 to 30 years, but at lower intensity, like I'm showing here. This is a prescribed fire, but historically wildfires would come through, or cultural fires would come through and burn at this kind of low severity. And these species are adapted to that. They can survive that kind of fire. And what we're starting to see now, which we've already heard many people touch on, is this change in how our fires are burning. So we are seeing more area burning, but we're also seeing in some of our drier forests these really large high severity patches. This is an example from down in the Bitterroot Valley here in Montana, but we've seen examples from all over where we have our dry forests burning at high severity and killing a lot of the trees. We've heard some of the reasons, this is partly due to climate change, and it's partly due to the forced relocation of indigenous people, suppression of indigenous cultural burning practices, as well as then active fire suppression. So we're seeing these changes in how our open understory, not a lot of small trees or some clusters of small trees. Now we're having these areas with kind of continuous small trees that are what we call lattifules. They're connecting that ground surface up to the canopy. And so now if we have a fire that comes through here, it won't stay on the ground. It will move right up into the canopy and kill these trees.
We may have lost Kim for a second.
Treatments can reduce fire severity. So we found over 40 studies that came from all over the Western US focused on these kind of drier forest types like mixed conifer forest, ponderosa pine forest, not our subalpine forest that maybe historically burned at higher severity. And these studies were all case studies where people had gone out and there was an area that had some kind of treatment adjacent to an area that was untreated. It burned in a wildfire, and then they quantified fire severity. So this isn't a modeling study. This is areas that actually burned in wildfires and what happened after those wildfires. And so we took the data from all of these studies and we brought it together so that we could look at the results of all these different types of treatments. And what I'm showing here is the change in wildfire severity here on the x-axis. And so any dot that is to the left of this dashed line, that's a plot where we had lower severity in the treated area compared to the adjacent nearby untreated sites. And so every single one of those points is an observation from a different study. And what you see is that we have highly effective treatments, but with some variability between treatment type. And so overall, thinning followed by prescribed burning was really the most effective treatment that reduced fire severity by, on average, 72%. So there's definitely some variability in here, but you can see this black dot is the average with the 95% confidence interval. So pretty consistent evidence for some significant reductions in fire severity when you're able to do both thinning and prescribed burning. We found that just prescribed burning, which is what's shown here in the yellow, is also effective. But there's many areas in the West where you can't just go in and do a prescribed fire because it's too dense, there's too many fuels. And so, these areas where only prescribed burning was done are potentially areas that had kind of lower tree density to begin with. But if you are able to get in there and burn without thinning first, it seems like that's also an effective treatment. And then additionally, thinning with pile burning. And so when we thin, we can create what's called slash, which are these branches, the woody fuels that might be left on the surface. And if we can pile those up and burn them or burn them in a prescribed fire, that really helps to reduce the fire severity when a fire burns through that area. So in contrast, you can see where we didn't do anything with the surface fuels, the thin only treatment, there is more variability. There's only an average 27% reduction in fire severity. And in some cases, there's even an increase in fire severity compared to the untreated areas. And that's due to these woody fuels that might be left on the ground. They can increase the intensity of the fire in some cases. There's some silvicultural prescriptions where they really remove the whole tree. They don't leave a lot of slash on the ground, and that might have a different effect. And then finally, as we're seeing all of these wildfires in our landscape, we really want to think about how we can leverage these wildfires and if they might actually be helping to do some of the work of these fuel treatments, that we can't do everywhere. And so we also looked at studies that had gone into an area that had burned once and then burned again, and how that affected the fire severity in the second wildfire. And we saw on average a 25% reduction in severity. But the really interesting thing here is that all of these points that are to the right, where we saw higher fire severity in the second fire, those all came from areas in California that had burned at high severity in the first fire. And so there is this, other scientists have found this too. In California, often when you have one high severity fire, it kind of begets another high severity fire because there's this huge shrub response. There's all these dead trees that add fuels. But most of our areas that had burned in low or moderate severity in the first wildfire then burned at lower severity in the next fire. So there is definitely room for, managed wildfire to play a part in treating our landscapes. And just to kind of dive a little bit more into the mechanisms of why thinning and prescribed burning combined tends to be most effective, it's because when we think about fire behavior, there's really two types of fuels. There's the canopy fuels, so how much biomass is up in the tops of the trees, and then the surface fuels. And by thinning, we reduce these canopy fuels, so you're unlikely for this fire to move from tree to tree to tree like it might appear. And by removing the surface fuels, we're reducing the intensity or the flame length of those flames. So they're just staying lower down. They're not getting up and torching the trees or creating a lot of heat. So where you can treat the canopy and the surface fuels, that's really the most effective type of treatment. And then we also looked at how old the treatments were when they were burned by a wildfire. And we found that if the treatments were less than 10 years old, they were much more effective than if they're older than 10 years. And that's because these fuels will start to grow back. Our forests are constantly changing and growing. And so in some areas, depending on how productive your system is, there might be a need to go back every 10 to 20 years to do another prescribed fire to keep those treatments as effective. And then since we've been talking about the bootleg fire, I thought I would throw this photo in here that was taken by Steve Rondeau from the Klamath tribes. And this is an area that the Klamath tribes and the Nature Conservancy and a couple other partners worked together to do some treatments. And you can see this was the area with thinning and prescribed fire, highly effective at reducing fire severity. This was a thinned area that hadn't been burned yet. And you can still see there is lower fire severity than this area with no treatment. There's still needles on those trees, but they are all scorched because the heat from the surface fire was really high. And then obviously in the no treatment area, we have a lot of high severity with really completely consumed crowns. And so this picture is just really emblematic of how these treatments affect wildfire severity. And so, yeah, overall, the study really showed that treatments that reduce both surface and canopy fuels can really reduce the severity of subsequent wildfire. But we really need to think about how old those treatments are and if we have the resources to go back and continue to keep these treatments active. There is definitely a role for prior wildfire and for using managed wildfire because we can't treat everywhere on our landscape. And so thinking about, using pods, for example, which Don brought up, thinking about areas where we can let, manage wildfire to have a more active role in the landscape under moderate fire weather conditions will be really important moving forward. And then I didn't show the data, but we did test for the effect of fire weather conditions, and we actually found no effect of fire weather on the effectiveness of our treatments. So we found that treatments could be effective across a range of fire weather conditions. And so that's really good news that even under some of the hotter and drier conditions that we saw, we did see treatments were pretty effective. Of course, we definitely need more research under these like plume-driven, really extreme fires that we're having in California. But overall, even in some of our hotter and drier fires, we were seeing reduced fire severity. And so, yeah, that's all I have, and I'm happy. I'm not sure if we have time now or maybe later for questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kim. Really great to see some good data on the effectiveness of these treatments. One question from Mary in the chat that I'll do really quick and then turn it over to Kevin Johnson from Pacific Gas and Electric. But were herbicides studied as an addition to thinning?
We didn't look at the role of herbicides in this study. There probably are some studies out there, but we focused just on thinning and prescribed fire.
Super. Thanks again, Kim. And we'll have time for more Q&A here shortly. But before we do that, I want to turn it over to Kevin Johnson, who's a principal at Pacific Gas and Electric's Wildfire Preparedness and Operations team, and is responsible for wildfire resilience partnerships for the company. Kevin, welcome. Thank you for making the time to be with us, and look forward to hearing from you on how PG&E is looking at wildfire as a company.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me and for inviting participation. I'm excited about this. Also, the last presentation, Kim, that was really interesting and helpful. Thank you. So let me share my screen here. I'm going to kind of run through a deck. We don't have too much time, so I'm going to try and keep it snappy. Can you see my screen okay, Kevin? Just confirm. Great. So real quick background on PG&E and who we are. We serve roughly 45% of California and about 40% of California's citizens. You can see over half of our service area is high risk to wildfire. We have a lot of power lines traversing a lot of high risk areas to serve far-flung customers. And so we're definitely exposed to this increasing wildfire risk, which is no secret to anybody. We started to touch on a little bit in California. The fires are getting bigger. This just kind of shows most of our big fires have happened since 2000, and the trend seems to be increasing after a couple of years off. This year, we're having that Park Fire and a lot of fires kicking up again. So that trend seems to be holding. In terms of what causes these wildfires, a disproportion of catastrophic fires, and this is kind of per structure destruction as opposed to acres burned. A disproportionate of number of power line fires turn into catastrophic fires, but also worth recognizing that even that being the case, is 30% of fires, the biggest fires in California, most destructive fires, have been caused by power lines. The other 70% were not. So it's definitely utilities are part of the challenge and opportunity, but there's a much bigger picture too. So what are we doing about that today? We basically have a combination of a portfolio of approaches. One is to basically have much better situational intelligence about when and where fires start, and also what's the oncoming weather, so we can change our operations. Two is that when we have more dangerous conditions, by time and space, we will effectively proactively turn off power. If there's a disturbance on a wire and a program called EPSS is set up, the wires are quick to turn off, so we will less likely to spark a fire. Also, if we have high winds in those circumstances, we will proactively turn off the power and tell our customers in advance. And then last, we're also hardening our system with strong poles, covered conductor, undergrounding distribution lines, and then doing a whole host of vegetation management, including removing or pruning 1 million trees per year. So those are all important things to reduce that risk, but I also think there's a big opportunity to do more, which is kind of what I'm going to talk about here. So basically, with California independently or investor-owned utilities are spending roughly about $10 billion per year to try and prevent those power line ignited fires. And that, again, is about 30% of the most destructive fires. And California utility customers have to pay the entire cost of that $10 billion per year. If you look on the right side of the risk bow tie, kind of what's the likelihood if a spark happens, which is inevitable, how big of a fire might it become? On the resilience side, we have not, I would say that's not been a focus so far of our investments. And you could look at CAL FIRE and US Forest Service generously, if you round up, investing maybe $2 billion a year. Those kind of tactics could help reduce risk from all fires and not just the power line started ones. And also that's an opportunity to share a lot of the costs to create this more robust resilience across many stakeholders rather than just all shareholders or all taxpayers. So I think this is an opportunity for us to potentially a rebalancing opportunity to see if we can bring some of this private investment and capital into this kind of broader forestry sector. The scale of need is pretty big. You can see before European arrival, I've seen estimates of 4 to 13 million acres that were on fire any given year. In 2022, California took credit for 750,000 acres treated. Now, a lot of that was private timber companies, and then some other grants and other work included. You see that the goals by next year is to get to increase by 33% to get to 1 million acres by 2030, to double it, what we're doing today, and then to even triple and beyond in years to come. And then the Air Resources Board said we should at least triple to hit our carbon goals for the state. And then if you wanted to optimize for society overall, there's a study that basically shows you'd want to treat about 4 million acres in California per year. So we have these big goals in a frankly tougher funding environment on the state side. And the federal government has this debt overhang we're gonna have to account for at some point too. So it's we're gonna have to do something different to get to these bigger numbers. A short way to saying that PG&E leaning into this space would be very much policy aligned at a state and federal level. A lot of co-benefits and frankly opportunity costs if we don't do this. And I'm preaching to the choir here, but keeping people safe, planet across ecosystem health, GHGs, biodiversity, water, a lot of customer benefits and being able to live in these locations. And then there are a lot of values that PG&E could invest against: liability reduction, electrical liability, asset defense, and affordability, I think, are key ones to look at. But we need to be able to value these in a way that we can invest. I think utilities could help catalyze this work. We have, as discussed, value in doing so. We have a lot of in-house expertise, foresters already on hand, former firefighters, a lot of this expertise in analytics. We're a big company that's looking at decades, and so I think we could anchor bigger projects and help pool dispersed groups together. We have our own lands we could bring to bear to improve this, and then hopefully we could help. We represent and also help attract a more diversified funding pool from just taxpayers. The way I see it, there are kind of three main activities that reinforce each other: defending communities, restoring more remote forest health, and then figuring out smart things to do with the wood that lower our costs and have co-benefits. So I would say we have 15 different programs that I'm piloting this year. This is the year of prove it. Is there something here? So I want to prove that there's the replicable thing that creates value that regulators would want to say yes to in advance of basically our next regulatory filing next year. So these are 15 different programs focused on these three areas, looking at distribution and transmission, private lands, public lands, planning versus execution, pre, post fire, what do you do with the wood, kind of all those themes, and trying to line up as many pilots as we can to A, show that we can do it, and then B, show that we can value it so that we can build a business case. So this year, basically, the goals are demonstrate these delivery models, develop valuation methodologies so that we can defend this investment and know where these dollars make more sense versus other dollars invested. Demonstrate that we can crowd in non-traditional funding, for example, voluntary carbon market funding. Lay preliminary groundwork for regulators to say yes when we spend this money, that we can then charge our customers for those costs. Demonstrate stakeholder support for environment, wildfire, and affordability value. Demonstrate financial forecast, integrate that, and then also do R&D as well. I want to call out to a couple of UT.org orgs. American Forest Foundation, Blue Forest Conservation have been kind of key partners on that, in addition to a lot of local partners on helping chart this path with us. That's kind of the quick lowdown. This is the next 6 months will be critical. Want our regulators to be really excited about this. They don't know it exists yet. So that's kind of the path we're on now.
Fabulous, Kevin. We could have given you, I think, an hour on your own, and I think you did a phenomenal job of, I think, laying out some really critical things on the all hands, all lands approach that was raised earlier, and I think on the really catalytic role that utilities could play in this space moving forward. So thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Here's what I'm going to do. We're going to send a follow-up survey because, again, the idea here is to gather some information from you all out in the audience about places where we can do some more deep dives around these critical topics. So we will share slide decks with you. We'll share some resources with you and ask for your input on what kind of other issues and other things around the wildfire space that you'd like to learn more about. And I also ask you to save the date for our next webinar, which will touch on, I think, a lot of these really interesting things that Kevin touched on, and the need for, I think, innovative and new ways to fund and finance forest conservation, forest restoration in the face of wildfires. So join us August 29th with the Conservation Finance Network. And thank you so much for making the time to be with us. Thanks to all of our speakers, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next month. Have a great day.